The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, turning the tarmac into a shimmering mirror of heat. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morrison stood beside the motionless F-35 Lightning II, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Sweat darkened the armpits of his flight suit as he stared at the $80 million aircraft that refused to function properly for the third consecutive day. "I want answers," Morrison barked at the assembled team of technicians. His voice carried across the flight line, causing several junior officers to flinch. "How is it possible that with every diagnostic tool at our disposal, with every expert on video conference, from Lockheed Martin, we still can't get this bird above 50% power without a system shutdown?" The lead technician, Captain Ellis, swiped through screens of data on his tablet. The information displayed showed all systems nominal. All checks passed all parameters within acceptable ranges. The computer insisted nothing was wrong, yet the aircraft stubbornly refused to function. "Sir, we've replaced the FADEC system, checked every millimeter of the fuel lines, and swapped out half the sensors. The software diagnostics show no errors." Ellis looked defeated, the dark circles under his eyes testament to the sleepless nights spent troubleshooting. "It's like chasing a ghost." Morrison's jaw clenched as he surveyed the row of F-35s lined up on the tarmac. 5 of them stood ready for the upcoming multinational exercise. The 6th, the squadron leader's aircraft, sat silent and useless. In 3 days, the Secretary of Defense would arrive with NATO allies and Japanese defense officials. The eyes of the world would be on this base on his squadron. "That's not good enough, Captain." Morrison's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "This aircraft will fly. I don't care what it takes." From the edge of the group, Colonel Samuel Hayes watched the exchange with a thoughtful expression. At 58, Hayes was a relic of another era of Air Force leadership. He had seen the transition from analog to digital, from mechanical to computational. He recognized the frustration on Morrison's face, the modern warrior trapped by technology he couldn't see or touch. Hayes stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, may I have a word?" Morrison turned, irritation flashing across his features before being masked by respect for the superior officer. "Of course, sir." The 2 men walked away from the group, stopping in the shadow of a hangar. The massive structure offered little relief from the heat, but it provided privacy. "Jack, I might know someone who can help." Hayes spoke quietly, his eyes still on the distant F-35. Morrison's laugh was short and harsh. "With all due respect, sir, we've had the best minds in the Air Force and the defense industry working on this. Unless you know someone at Lockheed with access to code, we don't have—" "I'm not talking about Lockheed Martin." Hayes turned to face Morrison directly. "I'm talking about Robert Callahan." "Callahan?" Morrison's brow furrowed. The name meant nothing to him. Hayes looked into the distance, his mind clearly somewhere else, somewhere in the past. "They called him the Steel Man. Desert Storm 991. We had an entire squadron of A-10 Thunderbolts grounded with an undiagnosable fault. 6 birds all showing the same problem, all passing every diagnostic check, but none would throttle up properly." Morrison's expression remained skeptical, but he stayed silent, allowing Hayes to continue. "Callahan did the impossible. He fixed all 6 A-10s in one night in the middle of the Iraqi desert using tools he fashioned from scrap metal." Hayes turned back to Morrison, his eyes intense with the memory. "Those A-10s flew the next morning and were crucial in saving hundreds of American lives in the 73 Easting engagement." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with all respect, you're talking about an A-10. That's a flying tank with wings. The F-35 is the most advanced aircraft in history. The technology is completely different." Hayes smiled slightly. "He didn't just work on A-10s, Jack. Callahan was part of Unit 777, a classified Air Force program that very few people know existed." Morrison's eyebrows rose. As someone with high-level clearance, he prided himself on knowing every special access program in the Air Force inventory, yet he had never heard of Unit 777. "What kind of program?" Hayes checked his watch. "How about I show you instead? I need to make a call, but if you're willing to try something unconventional, I think we might have a solution." Morrison glanced back at the silent F-35, then at the technicians still poring over diagnostic screens, showing nothing wrong with an aircraft that clearly wasn't working. "At this point, sir, I'm willing to try anything." Hayes nodded and pulled out his phone, walking further away to make a private call. Morrison watched him, doubt and curiosity battling in his mind. After a brief conversation, Hayes returned with a slight smile. "We need to take a drive, just you and me." 2 hours later, Hayes's government SUV turned off the main highway onto a dusty gravel road that seemed to lead nowhere. The terrain had changed from suburban Tucson to sparse desert dotted with saguaro cacti standing like ancient sentinels. The road wound through low hills until a small ranch came into view. The property was modest, a single-story house with a metal roof, a large workshop with its doors open and a few outbuildings. A vintage Ford pickup truck sat under a carport, its faded blue paint speaking of decades of service. The entire place had an air of simple functionality, nothing wasted, nothing for show. Hayes parked in front of the workshop. From inside came the rhythmic sound of metal being worked, the distinctive ring of a hammer on steel. "This is where the great savior lives." Morrison couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Hayes turned off the engine and fixed Morrison with a serious look. "Jack, whatever you think you know about aircraft, about what makes them work and what makes them fail, be prepared to have that challenge today. Robert Callahan is different." "Different how?" "He listens to machines in a way no one else can." Hayes opened his door, "And he might be the only person who can help us." They walked toward the workshop, the sound of metalwork growing louder. Inside, they found a man bent over an ancient tractor engine. Despite the heat, he wore long sleeves, a faded blue work shirt with the Air Force logo barely visible after countless washes. His hands, thick with calluses and mapped with the fine lines of age and labor, moved with precise, economical movements as he adjusted something deep within the engine block. He didn't look up as they entered, though Morrison was certain the man had heard them approach. "Bobby," Hayes called out. "Been a while." The man straightened slowly, his movements deliberate, as if each one was calculated to conserve energy. He turned to face them, wiping his hands on a rag that hung from his belt. Robert Callahan was in his early 80s with a face weathered by sun and time. His hair was silver white, cut in a military style that he had likely maintained for 60 years. But it was his eyes that caught Morrison's attention, pale blue, clear, and focused with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Callahan looked at Hayes for a long moment, then his face creased into a slight smile. "Sam Hayes, still causing trouble in the ranks, I see." The two men shook hands with the firm grip of old comrades. No hugs, no backslapping, just the simple acknowledgement of men who had shared experiences most civilians would never understand. Hayes gestured to Morrison. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morrison, F-35 Squadron Commander at Davis-Monthan." Callahan's penetrating gaze shifted to Morrison, who found himself standing straighter under the scrutiny. The older man nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect for the rank and reservation of judgment about the man who held it. "Sir," Morrison extended his hand. "Colonel Hayes speaks highly of your abilities." "Does he now?" Callahan's voice was a gravelly rumble, worn by years and perhaps by the desert sand of distant battlefields. He shook Morrison's hand, his grip still powerful despite his age. "Sam always did have an overactive imagination." Hayes chuckled. "Bobby, we have a situation. F-35 refusing to throttle up past 50%. All diagnostics show green. Birds grounded for 3 days with no answers." Callahan returned to his work on the tractor engine, his attention seemingly diverted, but Morrison sensed he was listening intently. "Sounds familiar," Callahan said after a moment. "What does Lockheed say?" "The usual," Hayes replied. "No fault found. Suggested we replace the entire FADEX system. We did. No change." Callahan nodded slowly, turning a wrench with precise movements. "And you came all the way out here because—" Hayes stepped closer. "Because in 3 days, the Secretary of Defense and representatives from 7 allied nations will be at Davis-Monthan for a joint exercise demonstration. Because the squadron commander's F-35 needs to be leading that demonstration. And because I remember what you did in Iraq with those A-10s when everyone else was clueless." Callahan set down his wrench and looked up, his eyes meeting Hayes's. Something unspoken passed between them, some shared memory or understanding. "I've been retired 20 years, Sam. That world doesn't need people like me anymore." He gestured toward Morrison. "They've got young officers with advanced degrees and computers that can diagnose a fault from 1,000 miles away." "Except when they can't," Hayes said quietly. "Except when all the technology in the world doesn't solve the problem." Morrison watched the exchange with growing impatience. This old man living in the middle of nowhere tinkering with tractor engines was supposed to solve a problem that had stumped Lockheed Martin's best engineers. Mr. Callahan, Morrison interjected, I appreciate Colonel Hayes's faith in your abilities, but the F-35 is the most advanced fighter jet ever built. It has millions of lines of code, quantum computing elements, systems that, Son, Callahan interrupted, his voice soft but commanding. A machine is a machine, whether it's this tractor, an A-10, or your fancy F-35. They all speak the same basic language. They tell you when they're happy, and they tell you when they're hurting. Most people just don't know how to listen. The workshop fell silent except for the ticking of a cooling metal. Morrison felt a strange discomfort under Callahan's steady gaze, as if the old man could see through his skepticism to something deeper. Hayes broke the silence. Bobby, I wouldn't have come if I didn't think this was important. And I wouldn't have come if I didn't think you were the only one who could help. Callahan sighed, looking down at his grease-stained hands. You always were persuasive, Sam. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Finally, he looked up again. Let me close up here. I'll follow you in my truck. Hayes smiled. Actually, I thought we'd give you a ride, might be more comfortable, and make it harder for me to change my mind and turn around. Callahan's eyes twinkled with a hint of humor. Fine, let me get cleaned up and grab my kit. As Callahan disappeared into the house, Morrison turned to Hayes. Sir, with all due respect, what exactly are we doing here? This man is in his 80s. How could he possibly understand the complex systems of an F-35? Hayes leaned against a workbench. Jack, there's something you should know about Robert Callahan and Unit 777. Back in 1975, the Air Force identified a small group of maintenance personnel who had what they called extraordinary mechanical intuition. These weren't just good mechanics. They were people who could diagnose problems that no one else could find, who could repair systems that everyone else declared irreparable. Morrison listened skeptically as Hayes continued. The Air Force created a special unit officially designated Technical Evaluation and Mechanical Diagnostics Specialist Unit 777, unofficially called the Prizrak Team. Prizrak means ghost in Russian. The name came from their ability to find the ghosts in the machine problems that seemed to have no explanation. This sounds like something from a science fiction movie, sir. Hayes smiled. I thought the same thing when I first heard about it. But I saw them work, Jack, in Desert Storm in Bosnia in the early days of Afghanistan. These weren't just mechanics, they were different. They had a relationship with machines that defied conventional understanding. And Callahan was one of these people. Not just one of them, he was their leader. The best of the best. Hayes lowered his voice. There were 12 members in the original unit. They were trained to work on every aircraft in the inventory under any conditions. They were deployed to forward operating bases, aircraft carriers, anywhere there was a critical mechanical problem that conventional methods couldn't solve. Morrison remained unconvinced. And why have I never heard of this unit? Because by 2005, the program was decommissioned. Computer diagnostics had become so advanced that the brass thought the unit was obsolete. They believed technology had made the ghost hunters unnecessary. Hayes looked toward the house where Callahan had disappeared. They were wrong. Before Morrison could respond, Callahan emerged carrying a worn leather satchel. He had changed into a clean shirt, still with long sleeves despite the heat, and had washed the grease from his hands. Up close, Morrison noticed a watch on Callahan's wrist, an old aviator's timepiece that looked like it had seen decades of service. The drive back to the base was mostly silent. Callahan stared out the window, occasionally glancing at Morrison in the rearview mirror. It was an evaluating look, as if the old man was taking his measure. Finally, Callahan spoke. Tell me about the aircraft, Colonel Morrison. Not the technical specifications, I can read those. Tell me how it behaves. The question caught Morrison off guard. Behaves? Yes, when you fly it, what's its personality? How does it feel in your hands? What does it sound like when it's running properly? What does it smell like in the cockpit? Morrison blinked, taken aback by the unusual line of questioning. He was used to technical debriefs, systems analyses, performance metrics. No one had ever asked him about the personality of his aircraft. It's responsive, he began hesitantly, smoother than anything I've ever flown, almost like it anticipates your intentions before you fully form them. He found himself warming to the topic. The sound is different from older jets, more of a high-pitched whine than a roar. The cockpit smells like new electronics in the recycled air system when it's working right. Callahan nodded, his eyes still on the desert landscape passing by. And when the problem started, Morrison thought back to the first signs of trouble. 3 days ago, pre-flight checks were normal. Started the engine sequence, everything nominal up to about 47% power, then warning lights. The engine wouldn't throttle up further. No unusual sounds, no vibrations, nothing visual, just stopped responding correctly. What did it smell like? Callahan asked. Morrison started to dismiss the question as irrelevant, then caught himself. I'm not sure. Normal, I think. Maybe there was something, a slight odor, almost like... He searched for the description. Almost like hot electronics, but very faint. I assumed it was just the Arizona heat on the tarmac. Callahan nodded again, this time with a small smile. Good. You're more observant than I expected, Colonel. Morrison wasn't sure whether to take that as a compliment or an insult. When they arrived at Davis-Monthan, Hayes pulled up to the security checkpoint. The guard recognized Morrison and Hayes immediately, but his eyes lingered on Callahan in the back seat. This is Mr. Callahan, a technical consultant, Hayes explained. He's with us. The guard nodded and waved them through, but Morrison noticed Callahan watching the young airman with a slight smile, as if sharing a private joke. Something amusing, Mr. Callahan? Morrison asked. Just remembering, the old man replied. Security was different in my day. More about who you knew, less about what was on your ID card. They drove directly to the hangar where the troubled F-35 had been moved. The massive doors were open, and inside the sleek, angular aircraft sat surrounded by diagnostic equipment, computers, and frustrated technicians. Captain Ellis approached as they parked. Sir, we've tried the new startup sequence Lockheed suggested. Same results, shut down at 47% power. Morrison nodded grimly. Captain, this is Mr. Callahan. He's a consultant. Colonel Hayes thinks he might be able to help. Ellis glanced at Callahan, taking in the weathered face, the simple clothes, the ancient leather satchel. His expression was a poorly concealed mix of skepticism and confusion. A consultant, sir, from which contractor? He's independent, Hayes interjected smoothly. Special technical advisor. Just give him whatever access he needs, Captain. Ellis looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but knew better than to challenge a full colonel. Yes, sir. Should I continue with the current testing protocol while he... No, Callahan spoke up. I need everyone to step back from the aircraft. No diagnostics, no power, no computers. Just let her sit quietly for a while. Ellis looked at Morrison in confusion. Morrison, despite his own reservations, nodded. Do as he says, Captain. The technicians reluctantly powered down their equipment and moved back from the F-35. A strange quiet fell over the hangar as Callahan approached the aircraft alone, his movements unhurried. He walked around the F-35 slowly, his eyes never leaving the sleek skin of the aircraft. He didn't touch it, didn't refer to any manuals or diagrams. He simply observed, occasionally tilting his head, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The technicians exchanged glances. One whispered something that made others chuckle quietly. Morrison felt a flash of embarrassment. This had been a mistake. This old man wandering around the aircraft like he was communing with it, it looked ridiculous. But Hayes stood calmly, arms folded, watching with complete confidence. Whatever he had seen Callahan do in the past had earned the colonel's absolute trust. After completing his circuit of the aircraft, Callahan stopped near the left engine intake. He knelt down, hid his movements careful but not frail, and peered underneath the fuselage where the engine housing met the airframe. May I have a flashlight? He asked, his voice carrying in the quiet hangar. A young sergeant hurried forward with a high-powered LED torch. Callahan thanked him with a nod and directed the beam into the narrow space. Sir, Ellis spoke up, unable to contain himself any longer. We've already inspected that area thoroughly with fiber optic cameras. There's nothing there. Is that so? Callahan didn't look up, his attention fixed on whatever he was examining. Interesting. He handed the flashlight back to the sergeant and straightened up, his eyes moving to the F-35's complex engine housing. He still hadn't touched the aircraft. I'd like to hear it run, he said. Morrison stepped forward. You want us to start the engine? Yes. but not a full start sequence. Just bring it up to exactly 37% power hold for 10 seconds, then shut it down. Ellis frowned. Sir, the standard diagnostic checks are at 25, 50, and 75%. There's no protocol for 37% specifically. That's why I'm asking for it, Callahan replied calmly. Sometimes what you need isn't in the manual. Morrison hesitated, then nodded to Ellis. Do it. 37% hold for 10, then shut down. Ellis clearly wanted to object but moved to comply. The cockpit was opened, and a technician climbed in to initiate the abbreviated start sequence. Callahan positioned himself near the left engine again, this time closing his eyes as the distinctive whine of the F-35's engine began to build. The sound rose in pitch and intensity as the power increased. When it reached approximately 37%, Callahan's eyes snapped open. There, he said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. Listen. Morrison strained to hear anything unusual, but the engine sounded normal to him, the same high-pitched whine he had described earlier. The technician in the cockpit called out, 37% holding. Callahan knelt down again this time, placing one hand flat against the metal skin of the aircraft. He closed his eyes once more, his expression one of intense concentration. After 10 seconds, the engine powered down as instructed. The hangar fell quiet again, but Callahan remained in his position, hands still against the aircraft. Finally, he stood and turned to Morrison and Hayes. I need to check one more thing. He opened his leather satchel and pulled out a small worn case. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a collection of oddly shaped handcrafted tools. They didn't look like any standard aircraft tools Morrison had ever seen. They appeared to be custom-made, their surfaces polished by decades of use. Callahan selected one, a long, slender metal instrument with a precisely angled bend at one end. It looked more like a surgical tool than something you'd use on an aircraft. Saban. Morrison felt a surge of alarm. Mr. Callahan, I can't allow unauthorized tools to be used on this aircraft. The maintenance protocols are extremely specific. Callahan regarded him calmly. This isn't for disassembly, Colonel. It's for listening. He held up the strange tool. This is a resonance probe. I made it myself back in '87 for the B-1 program. It amplifies vibrations in metal structures, vibrations too subtle for electronic sensors to detect. Before Morrison could object further, Callahan turned and placed the tool against a specific point on the engine housing, pressing his ear to the other end. It was such a simple, almost primitive approach compared to the millions of dollars of diagnostic equipment surrounding them that several technicians smirked openly. Captain Ellis stepped forward. Sir, this is highly irregular. I must protest. Let him work, Captain. Hayes intervened, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. Ellis subsided, though his disapproval was evident. Morrison found himself torn between his own skepticism and Hayes's apparent faith in this unconventional approach. Callahan moved the tool to several different points on the engine, listening intently each time. His expression remained focused, revealing nothing. Finally, he straightened up and returned the tool to his case. I know what's wrong with your aircraft, Colonel Morrison, he said quietly. All eyes turned to him. The hangar had grown more crowded as word spread about the strange visitor examining the troubled F-35. Junior officers and enlisted personnel had filtered in, watching the scene unfold from a respectful distance. Well, Morrison prompted, when Callahan didn't immediately continue. There's a hairline stress fracture in the pneumatic line that feeds the bleed air valve for the engine control system. Callahan's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. It's located approximately 20 centimeters inside the secondary intake manifold, just before the junction with the primary control valve. Ellis scoffed audibly. That's impossible. We've scoped that entire system twice with high-resolution cameras. There is no fracture. There is, Callahan insisted gently, but it's a pressure fracture. It only appears when the line is under the specific stress created at 37 to 40% power. At rest or at other power levels, the fracture closes completely invisible to any visual inspection. The technical explanation silenced Ellis momentarily. Morrison studied Callahan's face, looking for any sign of uncertainty, but found none. How can you possibly know that? Morrison asked. Because I heard it, Callahan replied simply. When you brought the engine to 37%, there was a distinct harmonic shift in the resonance pattern of the airflow. Not a sound you can hear with your ears, more of a vibration you can feel through the airframe. Morrison looked to Hayes, who nodded encouragingly. If Bobby says that's the problem, that's the problem. And I'm supposed to just take his word for it. Morrison felt his frustration building. Based on a vibration he claims to have felt with a homemade tool, Callahan wasn't offended by the skepticism. You don't have to take my word for it, Colonel. Pressurize that line to exactly 37% of normal operating pressure and inspect it with your cameras. You'll see the fracture. Ellis shook his head. Even if there is a fracture, which I doubt, how could it possibly cause the engine to fail at higher power settings? The bleed air system is redundant. Not in this case, Callahan explained patiently. When the fracture opens at 37%, it creates a pressure differential that the sensors interpret as a potential compressor stall. The FADEC system registers this as a threat condition and prevents further throttle increase. But since the fracture closes immediately when power reduces, no fault is recorded in the diagnostic system. The technical explanation was delivered with such precision and confidence that even Ellis seemed momentarily swayed. It would explain why the diagnostics show no fault, one of the younger technicians ventured. If the problem only exists in a transient state, exactly. Callahan nodded approvingly at the young man. Your computers are looking for a state of being. I'm listening for a moment of becoming the moment when everything changes. Morrison found himself torn between his instinctive skepticism of this old-school approach and the undeniable logic of the explanation. Captain Ellis prepared to test Mr. Callahan's theory. Set up a targeted pressure test of that specific pneumatic line. Ellis hesitated clearly, still doubtful, but moved to comply. Yes, sir, it will take about an hour to isolate that section and set up the test equipment. Do it, Morrison ordered. Then to Callahan, if you're right about this, then your F-35 will fly tomorrow, Callahan completed the sentence. And if I'm wrong, you've lost nothing but an hour of time you were already spending on failed diagnostics. It was a fair point. Morrison nodded curtly and turned to oversee the preparations for the test. As the technicians bustled about setting up the specialized equipment, he noticed that Callahan had stepped back, watching quietly from a distance. There was no smugness in his demeanor, no need to hover over the technicians and assert his theory. He simply waited, patient and still, like a man who had seen this scene play out many times before. Hayes moved to stand beside Morrison. He's something else, isn't he? Morrison kept his voice low. If he's right, I'll be impressed. But this whole business about listening to the aircraft, feeling vibrations that sensors can't detect, it sounds like mysticism, not engineering. Hayes chuckled. That's exactly what I said the first time I saw him work. But here's the thing about Bobby Callahan and the others from Unit 777. They weren't doing anything mystical. They just developed their senses in ways most people never do. They learned to notice patterns, harmonics, vibrations that most of us filter out. Like savants. In a way, yes, but it wasn't just natural ability. It was trained, honed over decades of working with aircraft under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Hayes looked toward Callahan with evident respect. The program was called PRISRAC for a reason. These men and women could find the ghosts that haunted our machines, the problems that seemed to have no explanation, no physical presence, until they suddenly appeared and disappeared again. Morrison remained skeptical, but something about Hayes's absolute conviction gave him pause. The colonel was no fool, no gullible believer in superstition. If he put this much faith in Callahan's abilities, there had to be something to it. The hour passed slowly. Ellis and his team worked methodically to isolate the pneumatic line and set up the pressure test. Callahan sat quietly on a nearby workbench, apparently lost in thought. Occasionally, he would glance up at the F-35, his expression unreadable. Finally, Ellis approached Morrison. We're ready, sir. The test equipment is set up, and we've calibrated for a targeted pressure of 37% of normal operating load on that specific line. Morrison nodded. Proceed, Captain. Ellis gave the order, and the test began. A technician monitored a screen showing the feed from a high-resolution fiber optic camera inserted into the pneumatic line. The pressure gradually increased, approaching the specified level. At precisely 37%, a collective gasp went up from the technicians clustered around the monitor. My God, Ellis whispered. It's there. Morrison pushed forward to see the screen. Clear as day, a hairline fracture had appeared in the inner wall of the pneumatic line, exactly where Callahan had said it would be. As they watched, the tiny crack widened slightly, allowing a minuscule amount of air to escape into the surrounding housing. The technician called out, 37.5% pressure fracture is now approximately zero point 0.3 millimeters wide. Ellis stared at the screen, then at Callahan, his expression a mixture of disbelief and newfound respect. How, how did you know? Callahan simply shrugged. The aircraft told me. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine despite the hangar's warmth. He had witnessed something he couldn't explain, something that challenged his understanding of modern aviation maintenance. Reduce pressure and prepare to replace that entire section, Morrison ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. He walked over to where Callahan sat. Mr. Callahan, I owe you an apology. You were right. The old man smiled slightly. No apology needed, Colonel. Skepticism is healthy in your line of work. But how did you know, really, Otto? Callahan considered the question for a moment. Every machine speaks its own language, Colonel. Some speak through data points and error codes that your computers can read. Others speak through vibrations, sounds, smells that only human senses can detect. He nodded toward the F-35. That aircraft was trying to tell you what was wrong all along. You just needed the right translator. As the maintenance crew began the process of replacing the damaged pneumatic line, Morrison found himself watching Callahan with new eyes. There was more to this unassuming old man than met the eye, much more. And suddenly Morrison was very curious about the secrets of Unit 777 and the man they called the Steel Man. But before he could ask more questions, the hangar doors opened and a commotion drew everyone's attention. A convoy of black SUVs with government plates was approaching at high speed, breaking at least a dozen base safety regulations. They screeched to a halt just outside the hangar entrance. From the lead vehicle emerged a tall figure in full-dress uniform, the 4 stars of a full general gleaming on his shoulders. The entire hangar fell silent as General William Thompson, commander of Air Force Strategic Command, strode purposefully toward them. Morrison snapped to attention, as did every uniformed person in the hangar. General, sir, we weren't expecting... But Thompson walked past Morrison without acknowledgement, his eyes fixed on one person only. He stopped directly in front of Robert Callahan, who had risen to his feet with the straight-backed posture of a lifetime military man. The 4-star general raised his hand in a sharp, formal salute. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan, it's an honor to see you again, sir. The hangar went completely still, every eye now on the elderly man in simple work clothes who was being saluted by one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Air Force. Morrison felt his jaw slacken in shock. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan. The general had just called him Lieutenant Colonel Callahan. Callahan returned the salute with perfect military precision, then lowered his hand. General Thompson, it's been a long time. Thompson broke into a rare smile. Not long enough for me to forget who saved my life over Iraq. He turned to address the stunned audience in the hangar, his voice carrying with the natural command of a lifelong leader. For those of you who don't know, you are standing in the presence of a legend. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Callahan, retired commander of Special Technical Unit 707, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 Silver Stars, and the Air Force Cross. Thompson's eyes swept the room. When I was a young captain flying an A-10 in Desert Storm, my squadron was grounded by a mysterious mechanical failure. With an entire battalion of American troops depending on our air support, Colonel Callahan worked through the night in the middle of the Iraqi desert to get our birds flying again. Morrison stared at Callahan in disbelief. This unassuming old man was not just some retired mechanic with unusual skills. He was a highly decorated officer, a unit commander, a genuine war hero. Thompson continued, his voice solemn. The next morning, those A-10s provided critical support at the Battle of 73 Easting. Without Colonel Callahan's intervention, we would have lost hundreds of American lives. He turned back to Callahan. I never forgot what you did, sir. None of us did. The hangar remained silent as the full impact of Thompson's words sank in. Captain Ellis stood open-mouthed, likely regretting his earlier dismissive attitude. The younger technicians looked at Callahan with newfound awe. Morrison felt a complex mix of emotions, embarrassment at his own skepticism, amazement at the revelation, and a growing sense that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple mechanical problem with his F-35. Thompson's gaze found Hayes. Colonel, I received your message. I came as soon as I could. Hayes nodded. Thank you for coming, General. I thought, given the history, you'd want to be here. You thought correctly. Thompson turned his attention back to Callahan. Lieutenant Colonel, I understand you've diagnosed our F-35 problem. Callahan nodded. Yes, sir. Pressure fracture in the bleed air pneumatic line. The maintenance team is replacing it now. Thompson smiled again. Of course you found it. He looked at Morrison. Colonel Morrison, I trust you're taking notes. You're witnessing something few modern officers ever get to see a master of the old school at work. Morrison stood straighter. Yes, sir, it's been educational. Good, because there's more to learn here. Thompson checked his watch. I've cleared my schedule for the remainder of the day. Once that F-35 is repaired, I want a full briefing from Colonel Callahan on his diagnostic process. He raised his voice to address the entire hangar. And I want every maintenance officer and senior NCO present. It's time we remembered that sometimes the most sophisticated sensor isn't a computer. It's a human being with decades of experience. As the general's words echoed through the hangar, Morrison looked at Callahan with new eyes. The old man met his gaze steadily, neither proud nor humble, simply present in the moment. In that instant, Morrison realized he was standing at a crossroads between the high-tech world he had built his career on and an older tradition of craftsmanship and intuition he had never fully appreciated. And somehow he knew that what he learned from Robert Steelman Callahan in the coming hours would change not just his F-35, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be an Air Force officer in the modern age. Thompson's words echoed through the hangar, leaving a profound silence in their wake. The revelation of Callahan's true identity transformed the atmosphere instantly. Technicians who had smirked at the old man's methods now stood straighter, their expressions a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Captain Ellis looked as if he wanted the hangar floor to open and swallow him whole. The Battle of 73 Easting would have turned out very differently without Colonel Callahan's intervention. Thompson continued, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. 347 American soldiers owe their lives to those A-10s being in the air that morning. Morrison struggled to reconcile the unassuming elderly man in worn work clothes with the decorated officer Thompson described. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Thompson turned his attention back to Callahan. When Colonel Hayes contacted my office, I was in a meeting with the Joint Chiefs. I left immediately. His voice softened. Some debts can never be repaid, but they should always be acknowledged. Callahan's expression remained unchanged, his humility genuine rather than affected. You would have done the same, General. Anyone would have. No, Thompson said firmly. Not anyone. Not then, not now. He looked around the hangar, his gaze sweeping over the assembled airmen. That's the point. Hayes stepped forward. General Thompson, Colonel Callahan, has identified the issue with the F-35. We're in the process of verifying his diagnosis. Thompson nodded. Of course he has. He looked at Morrison. Well, Colonel, what's the verdict? All eyes turned to Morrison, who found his professional composure again. Sir, we've confirmed Colonel Callahan's diagnosis. There's a pressure fracture in the pneumatic line of the bleed air system, only visible when under specific load conditions. It's extraordinary that he was able to detect it. Not extraordinary, Thompson corrected. Exceptional, yes, but this is precisely what Unit 777 was trained to do. He turned to Hayes. I want a complete briefing on this situation, and I want all senior maintenance personnel present. Yes, sir, Hayes replied. We can set up in the command briefing room. As Hayes began making arrangements, Morrison found himself standing awkwardly near Callahan. The tension of their earlier interactions hung between them, now complicated by the revelation of the older man's true identity. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan, Morrison began struggling to find the right words. I want to apologize for my earlier skepticism. I had no idea that I wasn't just some old crank. Callahan's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the closest thing to a smile Morrison had seen from him. No apology necessary, son. Healthy skepticism keeps the Air Force running. Morrison nodded, grateful for the older man's grace. May I ask, the unit you commanded, Unit 777, why haven't I ever heard of it? Callahan's eyes grew distant. Some programs stay in the shadows, Colonel, especially the ones that can't be easily explained or replicated. He paused, studying Morrison's face. Tell me, what would you have thought if someone told you about a group of people who could feel mechanical problems that sensors couldn't detect? I would have thought it was nonsense, Morrison admitted. Exactly. So the program stayed quiet. We did our work, solved problems when conventional methods failed, and went where we were needed. Callahan gazed around the hangar. Times change. Technology advances. Programs end. That's the way of things. Before Morrison could ask more questions, Hayes returned. We're set up in the briefing room. General Thompson wants to start immediately. The command briefing room was filled beyond capacity. Every senior maintenance officer and NCO on the base had been summoned along with squadron commanders and their executive officers. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation as Thompson took position at the front of the room, flanked by Hayes and Callahan. Ladies and gentlemen, Thompson began without preamble. What you witnessed today was not a fluke or a lucky guess. It was the application of a skill set that the Air Force once considered vital enough to create an elite unit around. He nodded to Hayes, who dimmed the lights. A classified designation appeared on the screen. Technical Evaluation and Mechanical Diagnostics Specialist Unit 777, PRISRAC. Well, in 1975, Thompson continued, the Air Force identified a small number of maintenance personnel who possessed what was termed extraordinary mechanical intuition. These individuals could diagnose and repair problems that defied conventional troubleshooting. They didn't just follow technical orders, they understood the machines at a fundamental level that went beyond training. Images appeared on the screen, technicians working on various aircraft from decades past, their faces intent with concentration. The Cold War created unique challenges. Aircraft were deploying to remote locations, operating under extreme conditions, facing problems that no manual could anticipate. Unit 777 was formed to address these situations. Thompson's voice took on a different tone, one of deep respect. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan was selected to lead this unit. His record spoke for itself. The screen showed a much younger Callahan in desert fatigues kneeling beside an aircraft engine, his face streaked with grease and sand. Unit 777 deployed to every major conflict. They solved problems that grounded entire squadrons. They saved missions, aircraft, and most importantly, the lives. Thompson paused, letting the significance sink in. And in 2005, the program was decommissioned. Computer diagnostics had become so sophisticated that leadership believed the human element was no longer necessary. Morrison noticed Callahan's face remain impassive at this statement, though something flickered in his eyes. Today, Thompson said, his voice hardening, we saw the flaw in that thinking. The most advanced aircraft in our inventory was grounded by a problem that all our technology couldn't identify. It took a man with experience and trained intuition to solve it. He looked directly at Callahan. Colonel, would you explain to these officers how you diagnosed the problem? All eyes turned to Callahan, who stepped forward with the natural authority of someone accustomed to command despite his age and simple attire. What I'm about to tell you isn't mystical or supernatural. He began, his gravelly voice carrying effortlessly through the room. It's about developing sensory awareness beyond what we typically train for. He picked up a piece of chalk from the board tray and rolled it between his fingers as he spoke. Every aircraft has a voice. It speaks through vibrations, sounds, smells, even the way air moves around it. When something changes, even something tiny, that voice changes. He looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the younger officers. Most of you have experienced this. You've been around an aircraft long enough that you sensed something was off before the alarm sounded. That's your brain processing subtle cues that you weren't consciously aware of. Heads nodded throughout the room. Every experienced aviator and technician had experienced that phenomenon. Unit 77 was trained to heighten that awareness, to consciously process those signals. Callahan set down the chalk and held up his hands. These aren't just tools for turning wrenches. They're sensors more sophisticated and adaptable than anything we can manufacture. He proceeded to explain the specific process he'd use with the F-35, the initial visual inspection, the careful listening to the engine at precisely 37% power, the use of the resonance probe to amplify vibrations. The fracture in that pneumatic line creates a specific harmonic distortion when it opens under pressure. It's like a whisper in a hurricane. You can't hear it unless you know exactly what you're listening for. Callahan's eyes swept the room. That's not magic. It's experience and training. As Callahan finished his explanation, the room remained silent. Morrison glanced around, seeing the same expressions on many faces. skepticism giving way to reluctant consideration and in some cases clear recognition. Thompson stepped forward again. I've made a decision. Effective immediately, I'm authorizing the creation of a pilot program here at Davis-Monthan. We're going to revive some of the training methods from Unit 777. He nodded toward to Morrison. Colonel Morrison will oversee the implementation with Colonel Callahan, serving as Chief Technical Advisor if he's willing. All eyes turned to Callahan, who seemed genuinely surprised by the proposal. He looked at Thompson, then at Hayes, clearly weighing the offer. I've been retired a long time, General, he said finally. I'm not sure how much I remember of the formal training protocols. You remember enough, Thompson replied with certainty. The details can be worked out. What's important is that this knowledge doesn't disappear. He addressed the room again. The future of aviation maintenance isn't just better computers and sensors. It's better trained human beings working with that technology. We lost sight of that. It's time to correct course. The briefing concluded with Thompson issuing direct orders. A core team would be assembled, documentation would be created, and a training syllabus developed. Morrison found himself suddenly responsible for a program he'd never heard of until a few hours ago based on principles he wasn't entirely sure he believed in. As the room cleared, Morrison approached Callahan. It seems we'll be working together, sir. So it does, Callahan replied, studying Morrison with those piercing blue eyes. Are you comfortable with that, Colonel, given your earlier skepticism? Morrison considered the question honestly. I'm still processing what I saw today, but results speak for themselves. He extended his hand. I look forward to learning from you. Callahan took the offered hand, his grip firm. Good answer. Skepticism is valuable as long as it doesn't prevent you from seeing what's right in front of you. The next morning dawned clear and hot, typical for Arizona in July. Morrison arrived at the hangar early to check on the F-35. The maintenance crew had worked through the night to replace the pneumatic line and conduct full system tests. Captain Ellis met him at the entrance, looking exhausted but satisfied. She's ready, sir, Ellis reported. Full power, all systems nominal. Whatever Colonel Callahan found, it's fixed now. Good work, Captain. Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. Get some rest. We'll need you fresh for the demonstration preparations. Morrison walked alone to the aircraft, circling it slowly as he'd seen Callahan do the day before. The sleek, angular shape of the F-35 represented everything modern about air warfare. Stealth, integrated systems, computing power. Yet this marvel of technology had been grounded by a tiny crack that all its sensors couldn't detect. Trying to hear her voice, Morrison turned to find Callahan approaching, carrying his leather satchel. Despite the early hour, the older man looked rested and alert. Just thinking, Morrison replied, about technology and its limitations. Callahan nodded. Technology expands our capabilities, but it also narrows our focus sometimes. We see what the sensors show us, not what's actually there. They stood in companionable silence regarding the aircraft together. Colonel Callahan, Morrison began, I'd like to understand better what happened yesterday, not just the technical aspects, but, he searched for the right words, the experience of it. How did you know to check at 37% specifically? How did you pinpoint that exact location? Callahan considered the question. Walk with me, he said, moving toward the open hangar doors. Outside, the morning sun was turning the desert landscape golden. The distant mountains stood purple against the brightening sky. When I was training for Unit 777, Callahan began, they taught us to clear our minds of preconceptions, to approach each aircraft as unique, not just a model or type. The F-35 in there isn't just an F-35. It's that specific F-35 with its own quirks and characteristics. Morrison nodded, following the logic. When you described the problem to me, you mentioned it failed at 47% power. That's an unusual number. Not a standard test point. It suggested the failure was pressure-related, occurring in a range we don't typically test. Callahan's eyes were on the horizon as he spoke. I chose 37% based on experience. Pressure fractures typically appear just before system failure. If it fails at 47, the critical stress point is likely around 37. And the location. That was observation and inference. The symptoms pointed to the bleed air system. The exact location. Callahan paused. That's harder to explain. It's pattern recognition built from thousands of similar problems. The harmonic resonance I detected has a signature that indicates distance from the source. It's like knowing where a gunshot came from by the sound. Morrison tried to process this. It wasn't mystical, as Callahan had insisted, but it was a level of perception beyond what most technicians were trained to develop. Could anyone learn this? Callahan smiled slightly. To some degree, yes. Some have more natural aptitude than others, just like some people have perfect pitch for music. But everyone can improve their sensory awareness with proper training. He looked directly at Morrison. Even squadron commanders who rely too heavily on computer diagnostics. Morrison accepted the gentle jab with a nod. Point taken. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Hayes and Thompson. The general had exchanged his formal uniform for standard flight gear, looking ready for a day of work rather than ceremony. Gentlemen, Thompson greeted them, I've been speaking with the base commander. We're setting up a temporary office for the new program, and I've made some calls to track down other surviving members of Unit 777. He looked at Callahan. Frank Mendoza is in San Antonio. Maria Diaz is teaching at Embry-Riddle. James Washington is working for Boeing as a consultant. Callahan's expression brightened at the names. They're all still around, good people, all of them. The best, Thompson agreed, and we need them if they're willing to help. This program needs to be built on solid foundations. As they discussed logistics, Morrison noticed a young sergeant hovering nearby, clearly waiting for an opportunity to speak. He recognized him as the same sergeant who had provided the flashlight to Callahan the day before. Sergeant Rodriguez, isn't it? Morrison called. Did you need something? The young man approached, coming to attention. Yes, sir. I was hoping to speak with Colonel Callahan, if that's permitted. Callahan turned, studying the young man with interest. What can I do for you, Sergeant? Rodriguez seemed nervous but determined. Sir, yesterday when you were working on the F-35, I watched how you approached it, how you listened to it. It reminded me of my grandfather. He was a mechanic for Pan Am for 40 years. He always said machines talk to you if you know how to listen. Callahan nodded encouragingly. Your grandfather was a wise man. Yes, sir. I've always tried to work that way, but my instructors... Rodriguez hesitated. Well, they emphasize the technical manuals and diagnostic systems. I was wondering if this new program, if there might be a place for someone like me. Morrison watched the interaction with interest. Here was exactly the kind of person they needed. Someone with natural inclination toward the methods Callahan employed, but constrained by modern training protocols. Callahan looked to Thompson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Sergeant Rodriguez, I think you just volunteered to be our first student. Report to Colonel Morrison for details once the program is established. The young sergeant's face lit up. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. As Rodriguez returned to his duties, Morrison felt a shift in his own perspective. Yesterday, he had viewed Callahan's methods as anachronistic, perhaps even superstitious. Today, seeing the enthusiasm in Rodriguez's eyes, he began to understand the value of what had nearly been lost. We should get the F-35 in the air, Morrison said. Confirm that everything's functioning properly. Good idea, Thompson agreed. And I think our technical advisors should be present for the test flight. Morrison glanced at Callahan. Would you like to observe from the tower, sir? Callahan shook his head. If it's all the same to you, I prefer to stay on the ground. You can hear more from down here. Preparations for the flight test moved quickly. Morrison changed into his flight suit and conducted his pre-flight checks with meticulous care. Everything appeared normal, all systems reporting ready status. As he climbed into the cockpit, he found himself more aware of the aircraft's feel than usual, conscious of the subtle vibrations and sounds that he typically ignored. From the edge of the tarmac, Callahan watched the proceedings with Hayes and Thompson beside him. Several of the maintenance crew had gathered as well, including Ellis and Rodriguez. The mood was one of cautious optimism. Morrison initiated the startup sequence. The F-35 systems came online smoothly, displays illuminating in sequence. The engine spooled up, its distinctive whine building steadily. 30% power, 40%, 50% past the previous failure point, 60%, full power. The aircraft responded perfectly, every indicator showing normal operation. In the cockpit, Morrison felt a surge of relief and satisfaction. He taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and accelerated down the strip. The F-35 lifted smoothly into the Arizona sky, climbing rapidly into the clear blue. For 30 minutes, Morrison put the aircraft through a series of increasingly demanding maneuvers. The F-35 performed flawlessly, responding to his inputs with the precision he'd come to expect from the advanced fighter. Whatever Callahan had found and fixed it had completely resolved the issue. Upon landing, Morrison was met by the waiting group. Hayes and Thompson looked pleased, the maintenance crew relieved. Callahan simply nodded once, as if the successful flight was exactly what he had expected. "How did she feel?" Colonel B. Callahan asked as Morrison removed his helmet. "Perfect," Morrison replied honestly. "Smooth, responsive, exactly as she should be." "Good." Callahan glanced at the aircraft now cooling in the morning sun. "She's happy now." The phrase struck Morrison as oddly fitting. The machine did seem almost alive in a way he hadn't considered before. Not sentient, certainly, but possessing a kind of integrity that went beyond the sum of its parts. Thompson stepped forward. "Excellent work, everyone. Now we need to ensure that what happened here becomes standard procedure, not an exceptional event." He turned to Morrison. "Colonel, I want you to work with Colonel Callahan to document every aspect of this incident, from initial symptoms to resolution. That will be the foundation of our new training program." "Yes, sir," Morrison replied, already mentally outlining the report. "Colonel Callahan," Thompson continued, "I'd like you to begin drafting an outline for a training syllabus. Focus on the sensory awareness techniques that form the core of Unit 777's methodology." Callahan nodded. "I can do that, General. But I should warn you, this isn't something that can be taught in a classroom alone. It requires hands-on experience, trial and error, the development of intuition over time." "Understood," Thompson replied. "We'll incorporate practical training from the beginning." As the group dispersed to their various tasks, Morrison found himself walking beside Callahan toward the base headquarters. "Colonel," Morrison began, "there's something I've been wondering about. Your uniform yesterday, long sleeves despite the heat, and again today." Callahan's pace slowed slightly. "You're observant, good quality in a pilot. It's not my place to ask, but—" Callahan stopped walking and considered Morrison for a moment. Then, with deliberate movements, he rolled up his left sleeve to reveal a forearm marked by extensive scarring, old burn tissue that had healed but would never fade. "Desert storm," Callahan explained quietly. "One of our birds took a hit, caught fire on the runway. Pilot was trapped. I went in after him." He rolled the sleeve back down. "I got him out. The scars are just a reminder." The simple statement carried the weight of unspoken heroism. Morrison nodded, understanding both the physical reason for the long sleeves and the deeper reason Callahan avoided drawing attention to his injuries. "Thank you for telling me," Morrison said simply. Callahan nodded and resumed walking. "The point is, Colonel Morrison, that machines aren't the only things that speak to us. People do too, through their actions, their questions, their concerns." He glanced at Morrison. "You've been wondering about my sleeves since yesterday. Your face shows it, your posture changes when you look at them. Just like the F-35 showed signs of distress that its sensors couldn't report." The parallel wasn't lost on Morrison. Human observation and intuition applied universally, to machines and people alike. It was a perspective that extended far beyond aircraft maintenance. They reached the headquarters building and were directed to a conference room that had been hastily repurposed for their use. Maps and diagrams covered one wall, a whiteboard another. Several computers had been set up, and boxes of technical manuals sat on a side table. "Home sweet home, at least for the duration," Hayes commented as he joined them. "General Thompson has authorized whatever resources we need. This program has top priority." The next several hours were consumed with planning and documentation. Morrison detailed every aspect of the F-35 incident, while Callahan began outlining training methodologies. Hayes coordinated logistics, arranging for the former Unit 777 members Thompson had mentioned to be contacted. As afternoon approached, Rodriguez appeared at the doorway carrying a stack of technical manuals. "Sir, the materials you requested from the archives." "Thank you, Sergeant," Hayes replied. "Just put them on the table." Rodriguez hesitated. "Sir, while I was in the archives, I found something else that might be relevant." He placed the manuals down and pulled out a faded folder. "It's a report from 1991 Operation Desert Storm. It mentions Colonel Callahan and Unit 777 specifically." Callahan looked up from his work, his interest clearly piqued. "Let me see that." Rodriguez handed over the folder. Callahan opened it carefully, revealing yellowed pages covered in typewritten text portions, redacted with heavy black marker. His eyes scanned the contents, a slight smile forming as he read. "I remember this," he said more to himself than the others. "The A-10 squadron at Algebra Air Base. 6 aircraft grounded with identical fuel system failures." Morrison moved closer, curious about this documented instance of Callahan's past work. "What happened?" "Microscopic sand infiltration in the fuel control units." Callahan replied, still reading. "The desert sand in Kuwait was finer than anything our filters were designed for. It was causing intermittent pressure drops that the diagnostics couldn't pinpoint." He looked up. "We modified the filters using material from Russian MiG parts we found abandoned on the airfield. Unorthodox but effective." "The Russians use finer filter material?" Morrison asked. "They had to," Callahan explained. "Soviet-era aircraft operated in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They designed for durability over complexity." He tapped the report. "Sometimes the old solutions are the best ones, even for new problems." Rodriguez remained by the door, clearly fascinated by the conversation, but unsure if he should stay. Morrison made the decision for him. "Sergeant, since you're going to be part of this program, you might as well join us." He gestured to an empty chair. "We could use a fresh perspective." The young sergeant sat down eagerly. "Thank you, sir." Hayes looked over from his computer. "I've made contact with Mendoza in Washington. They're both interested in participating. Diaz is currently overseas but will be back next week." "Good people," Callahan repeated his earlier assessment. "Frank Mendoza could diagnose hydraulic problems just by feeling the vibrations through the airframe. Maria Diaz had the best ears in the unit, could tell you exactly which bearing was starting to fail just by the sound. And James Washington," he shook his head in admiration, "that man could smell electrical problems before they happened. Literally smell them." Rodriguez leaned forward, captivated. "How did the unit train these abilities, sir?" Callahan considered the question. "It varied by individual and specialty. For some, it was sensory isolation exercises, learning to focus on specific inputs while filtering out distractions. For others, pattern recognition training. We studied thousands of failure cases, learning to connect subtle symptoms with specific causes." He stood and moved to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. With quick, precise strokes, he began sketching what looked like a flow chart. "The fundamental principle is this: machines exhibit patterns of behavior that indicate their condition. These patterns manifest across multiple sensory domains: visual, auditory, tactile, even olfactory. By training yourself to recognize these patterns holistically, not just through instrument readings, you develop a more complete understanding of the system state." Morrison watched as Callahan continued sketching, adding details to what was becoming a comprehensive training methodology. The older man moved with renewed energy, clearly in his element, now that he was sharing knowledge that had been dormant for years. "This is just the beginning," Callahan said, stepping back from the board. "The real training happens on the flight line with actual aircraft. Theory only takes you so far." Hayes's phone rang, interrupting the discussion. He answered, listened briefly, then looked at Morrison. "Colonel General Thompson requests your presence at the command center. Something about the upcoming demonstration." Morrison nodded and stood. "I'll be right there." He turned to Callahan. "Please continue without me, sir. This is valuable material." As Morrison left the room, he heard Callahan begin explaining another aspect of the Unit 777 methodology to Rodriguez, who was taking rapid notes. The scene gave him an unexpected sense of optimism. Knowledge that might have been lost forever was being preserved and passed on to a new generation. The command center was a hub of activity when Morrison arrived. Thompson stood at the central display, conferring with the base commander and several staff officers. He looked up as Morrison entered. "Colonel, join us. We have a situation developing with the multinational exercise." Morrison approached the display, which showed a map of the exercise area and flight plans. "What's the issue, sir?" "The Japanese contingent has arrived early," Thompson explained. "Their F-35s will be landing within the hour. They're expecting a joint systems integration check tomorrow morning." Morrison understood the implication immediately. "Our demonstration aircraft needs to be ready." "Exactly," Thompson studied the map. "Their defense minister is particularly interested in our maintenance protocols. This is as much diplomatic as it is military." "The aircraft is fully operational now, sir." Morrison assured him. We can proceed as planned. Thompson nodded. Good, but I want Callahan involved in the preparations. His insights could be valuable, especially if any issues arise. Of course, sir. Morrison hesitated, then added, General, may I ask a question about Unit 777? Thompson looked at him with interest. Go ahead. Why was it shut down if the program was as valuable as it seems? Why discontinue it? The general's expression grew thoughtful. Politics partly, budget constraints, but mostly it was a failure of vision. As technology advanced, leadership became convinced that human intuition was becoming obsolete. Computer diagnostics expert systems AI. They were supposed to replace the need for the specialized skills Unit 777 developed. He shook his head. It was short-sighted. And now we have a chance to correct that mistake. Thompson's tone was resolute. The most advanced sensors in the world missed what Colonel Callahan found in minutes. That's a lesson we can't afford to ignore. Morrison nodded, understanding the significance of what they were undertaking. This wasn't just about fixing a single aircraft or creating a training program. It was about rebalancing the relationship between human expertise and technological advancement, finding the optimal integration of both. I'll have Colonel Callahan join the preparation team immediately, sir, Morrison said. Good, and Morrison. Thompson fixed him with a serious look. Learn everything you can from him. Men like Robert Callahan are rare. Their knowledge is irreplaceable. Yes, sir, I understand. As Morrison left the command center, his thoughts were on the remarkable turn of events over the past 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he had been a frustrated squadron commander with a grounded aircraft and no solutions. Now he was at the center of a program that could potentially transform Air Force maintenance philosophy. And it had all begun because an old man in a workshop had listened to a machine's whispers when everyone else was deaf to them. Morrison returned to the conference room to find Callahan and Rodriguez deep in discussion, the whiteboard now covered with diagrams and notes. Hayes was on the phone, presumably coordinating with the other former Unit 777 members. Colonel Callahan, Morrison interrupted apologetically, General Thompson has requested your presence for the preparation of tomorrow's demonstration. The Japanese contingent has arrived early. Callahan nodded, capping the marker he was holding. Of course. The diplomatic aspect is always important. He turned to Rodriguez. Sergeant, review those materials I mentioned. We'll continue this later. Rodriguez stood. Yes, sir. Thank you for the instruction. As they walked toward the hangar, Morrison briefed Callahan on the situation. The older man listened carefully, asking occasional questions about the Japanese visitors and their expectations. Integration checks can be tricky, Callahan commented. Different countries, different maintenance philosophies, even with the same aircraft model. Have you worked with Japanese Defense Forces before? Morrison asked. Once in the 90s, very meticulous, excellent technical skills. Callahan's expression became thoughtful. They have their own version of what we did in Unit 777, you know. They call it Kansei engineering, the integration of human sensory perception into technical processes. Morrison found this fascinating. So the concepts are universal. More or less, every culture with advanced technology eventually recognizes that pure automation has limits. The human element remains essential. Callahan glanced at Morrison. That's what tomorrow is really about, isn't it? Showing that American maintenance expertise goes beyond computers and diagnostics. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, Morrison agreed. General Thompson seems particularly focused on that aspect. They reached the hangar where Morrison's F-35 was undergoing final checks before the next day's demonstration. Captain Ellis was supervising, looking considerably more respectful when he saw Callahan approaching. Colonel Callahan, sir, Ellis greeted him. We've completed the full systems check as requested. Thank you, Captain. Callahan approached the aircraft, his eyes already scanning its exterior. Let's make sure she's ready to welcome our guests. As Callahan began his methodical inspection, Morrison found himself watching with new appreciation. Yesterday, he had seen an old man using outdated techniques. Today, he saw a master craftsman practicing an art that technology had nearly rendered extinct. And in that moment, Morrison understood what they were really preserving. Not just a set of diagnostic techniques, but a fundamental connection between human and machine that had been central to aviation since its earliest days. It was a connection that no amount of technological advancement could or should replace. The soul of the fighter jet wasn't in its computers or its stealth materials or its weapon systems. It was in the understanding that passed between the aircraft and those who flew and maintained it. An understanding that could only exist when humans remained at the center of the process, listening with all their senses to what the machine was trying to tell them. As the desert sun began to set, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Morrison made a silent promise to himself. The knowledge that Callahan and Unit 777 had developed would not be lost again. He would make certain of that for the sake of the Air Force and for all who depended on these magnificent machines to keep them safe in the skies. The soul of the fighter jet would continue to speak, and now there would be people trained to listen. Dawn broke over Davis-Monthan Air Force Base with a symphony of activity. The Japanese delegation had arrived the previous evening, their F-35s now lined up alongside the American fighters on the tarmac. Morrison stood at the edge of the flight line watching as ground crews prepared for the day's demonstration. The air carried the distinctive scent of jet fuel and the metallic tang of morning dew evaporating from sun-warmed aircraft. "Impressive sight," a voice said beside him. Morrison turned to find Callahan already dressed and alert despite the early hour. The older man surveyed the row of F-35s with professional appreciation. 30 years ago, this would have been science fiction. Morrison nodded in agreement. "Sometimes I forget how far we've come. The computing power in just one of these aircraft exceeds what was available to the entire Air Force when you were leading Unit 777. Technology advances," Callahan acknowledged, "but the fundamentals remain. Aircraft still need lift to fly, engines still need combustion, and metal still fatigues under stress." He glanced at Morrison. "Are you ready for today?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Today wasn't just about demonstrating aircraft performance. It was about validating Callahan's unconventional methods before an international audience. "As ready as I'll ever be," Morrison replied honestly. "General Thompson has arranged for you to brief the Japanese maintenance team before the flight demonstration. They're particularly interested in what happened with our troublesome F-35. Callahan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that wise? I thought my methods were considered unorthodox." "That's precisely why the general wants you involved. He believes there's diplomatic value in showing that American expertise extends beyond technology." Morrison smiled. "Besides, the Japanese engineers might be more receptive to your approach than you expect. According to Thompson, they have their own tradition of integrating human sensory awareness into technical processes." "Kansei engineering." Callahan nodded. "Yes, I've encountered it before. Different terminology, similar principles." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Captain Ellis, who had undergone a remarkable transformation in his attitude toward Callahan since the revelation of his true identity. "Colonel Callahan, Colonel Morrison," Ellis saluted crisply. "The Japanese delegation is assembling in Hangar 3 for the technical briefing. General Thompson asks that you join them in 15 minutes. "Thank you, Captain," Morrison replied. "How are our birds looking this morning?" "All systems nominal, sir. Your F-35 has been performing flawlessly since the repair." Ellis's eyes flickered to Callahan with unmistakable respect. "The maintenance crews work through the night to ensure everything is perfect for today's demonstration." "Good work." Morrison dismissed Ellis with a nod, then turned back to Callahan. "Shall we head over?" They walked together across the tarmac, the rising sun casting long shadows ahead of them. Morrison noticed that Callahan moved with a slight stiffness, this morning the only outward indication of his age. "Are your quarters comfortable?" Morrison asked. "I know the BOQ isn't exactly the Ritz." Callahan chuckled, a rare sound that transformed his weathered face. "Son, I spent 6 months sleeping on a cot in a hangar in Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm. The bachelor officer's quarters feels like a palace by comparison." Hangar 3 had been transformed overnight into a presentation space. Rows of chairs faced a podium and screen, while displays around the perimeter showcased various aircraft components and maintenance equipment. The Japanese delegation sat in the front rows, a group of about 20 officers and engineers in immaculate uniforms. General Thompson stood at the front, engaged in conversation with a distinguished Japanese officer. Thompson spotted Morrison and Callahan entering and motioned them forward. "Colonel Morrison, Colonel Callahan, allow me to introduce General Takahashi of the Japan Air Self-Defense Force." The Japanese officer bowed respectfully before extending his hand. "Colonel Morrison, I have heard much about your squadron's excellent record." His English was precise and fluent. He turned to Callahan with particular interest. And Colonel Callahan, it is truly an honor. General Thompson has shared some of your remarkable achievements with me. Callahan shook the offered hand with a slight bow of his own. The honor is mine, General Takahashi. I've always admired the technical expertise of the JASDF. Thompson guided them to the front of the room. Gentlemen, we're about to begin. Colonel Callahan will present first, explaining the recent diagnostic challenge and solution. Colonel Morrison will follow with an overview of the flight demonstration scheduled for this afternoon. As the room settled, Morrison took a seat in the front row, curious to see how Callahan would present his unorthodox methods to this audience. The older man approached the podium with the quiet confidence of someone who had briefed countless military personnel throughout his career. Distinguished guests, fellow officers, Callahan began, his gravelly voice carrying clearly through the hangar. What I'm about to share isn't revolutionary or mysterious. It represents a fundamental approach to aircraft maintenance that complements rather than replaces modern diagnostic technology. For the next 30 minutes, Callahan walked the audience through the F-35 incident, explaining his methodology with clarity and precision. He avoided technical jargon where possible, focusing instead on the principles of heightened sensory awareness and pattern recognition. Throughout his presentation, Morrison observed the Japanese delegation. Rather than the skepticism he had initially shown, they displayed intense interest, several taking detailed notes. When Callahan described the pressure fracture and explained how it had eluded conventional diagnostics, one of the Japanese engineers leaned forward, asking a question in rapid Japanese. General Takahashi translated. Engineer Watanabe asks if you believe such techniques could be systematically taught or if they require innate talent. Callahan considered the question thoughtfully. Both. Just as some people have a natural aptitude for music or mathematics, some individuals possess greater mechanical intuition than others. However, the basic principles can be taught to anyone with sufficient technical background. It's a matter of developing awareness and training in the senses to recognize patterns. The answer seemed to satisfy the engineer, who nodded and made additional notes. Several more questions followed, each demonstrating genuine interest rather than polite formality. By the time Callahan concluded his presentation, the atmosphere in the room had transformed from diplomatic courtesy to professional engagement. Morrison took the podium next, outlining the afternoon's flight demonstration. As he explained the maneuvers and systems integrations planned for the event, he found himself incorporating elements of Callahan's approach, suggesting that the Japanese pilots might notice certain vibration patterns or sound signatures during specific flight phases. The words came naturally, as if Callahan's perspective was already influencing his thinking. When the briefing concluded, General Takahashi approached them with evident enthusiasm. Most impressive, Colonel Callahan. Your methodology resonates strongly with aspects of our own maintenance philosophy. We have a saying, the machine speaks to those who know how to listen. A universal truth, it seems, Callahan replied with a slight smile. Indeed. Takahashi turned to Thompson. General, I would be honored if Colonel Callahan could meet with our maintenance team before the demonstration. I believe there is much we could learn from each other. Thompson nodded, pleased. Of course. We've scheduled an hour before the flight operations begin. Colonel Callahan will be at your disposal. As the Japanese delegation filed out for their next appointment, Thompson drew Morrison and Callahan aside. That went better than I anticipated. You've made quite an impression, Bobby. Callahan shrugged modestly. They're receptive because they already understand the principles. The Japanese have never abandoned the human element in their technical processes, even as they've embraced automation. A balance we would do well to recapture, Thompson agreed. Which brings me to my next point. I've received provisional approval from Air Force headquarters to establish the program we discussed, not just as a Davis-Monthan initiative, but as an Air Force-wide training protocol. Morrison felt a surge of surprise and satisfaction. That's excellent news, sir. There's more, Thompson continued. The Japanese have expressed interest in joint training exercises based on these methodologies. General Takahashi sees potential for enhanced interoperability between our forces. Callahan's eyebrows rose. That's unexpected and significant. Indeed, what started as a grounded F-35 may end up strengthening our alliance in ways we hadn't anticipated. Thompson checked his watch. I need to meet with the base commander. Morrison, ensure everything's ready for the demonstration. Callahan, prepare for your session with the Japanese maintenance team. As Thompson departed, Morrison turned to Callahan. Congratulations, sir. Your expertise is being recognized at the highest levels. It's not about me, Callahan replied, his eyes distant. It's about preserving knowledge that shouldn't be lost. The men and women of Unit 777, they deserve better than to have their skills discarded as obsolete. Morrison sensed there was more to that statement than Callahan was expressing. What happened when the unit was disbanded? Callahan's face tightened almost imperceptibly. What always happens when the military decides a program is no longer necessary. Some retired, some transferred to conventional maintenance units. Others left the service entirely. He paused. Skills honed over decades gone overnight because someone decided computers could do it all. The bitterness in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison recognized it as the frustration of a commander who had seen his people undervalued. Well, those skills are being recognized now, Morrison offered, and you'll have a chance to ensure they're passed on to a new generation. Callahan nodded, his expression softening slightly. Yes, that's what matters now. He gestured toward the hangar exit. We should prepare for the afternoon's activities. You have a demonstration to fly, and I have Japanese engineers to talk with. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Morrison supervised final preparations for the flight demonstration, while Callahan met with the Japanese maintenance team. By early afternoon, everything was ready. 6 American F-35s and 4 Japanese F-35As stood on the tarmac, gleaming in the Arizona sun. A viewing area had been established for the official observers, including General Thompson, General Takahashi, and various diplomatic personnel. Morrison completed his pre-flight checks with meticulous care, acutely aware of the significance of today's demonstration. His F-35, the same aircraft that had been grounded just days before, would lead the formation. As he prepared to climb into the cockpit, he spotted Callahan approaching across the tarmac. The older man stopped beside the aircraft, his expression serious. A moment, Colonel, Morrison paused. Of course, sir. I've been talking with the Japanese engineers, Callahan said, his voice low enough that only Morrison could hear. They've encountered similar issues with their F-35s. Not identical, but related pressure anomalies in the bleed air system. Serious enough to ground aircraft? Not yet, but they're concerned. Callahan glanced toward the Japanese F-35s. During your demonstration, pay particular attention to Aircraft 3 and their formation. The pilot reported subtle vibrations during high-G maneuvers at altitude. Morrison frowned. Shouldn't they ground it if there's a concern? They've run all the diagnostics. Everything shows nominal, just like your bird did. Callahan's eyes met Morrison's. I've suggested they might have a developing issue, but without concrete evidence. Morrison understood immediately. The Japanese engineers, despite their interest in Callahan's methods, would need more than a theory to ground an aircraft during an international demonstration. What exactly should I listen for? Morrison asked. During formation flight, especially in turns, listen for a harmonic discrepancy between your engine sound and theirs. If Aircraft 3 has the issue, I suspect you'll hear a subtle resonance shift at certain power settings. Callahan's expression was grave. It might be nothing, but if it's what I think, I'll pay attention, Morrison promised. Any other advice? Callahan considered for a moment. Trust your senses, Colonel, not just your instruments. If something feels wrong, it probably is. With those words, Callahan stepped back and offered a formal salute. Morrison returned it, then climbed into the cockpit, Callahan's warning weighing on his mind. The startup sequence proceeded normally, all systems reporting ready status. Morrison taxied to the runway, the other American F-35s following in precise order. Across the tarmac, the Japanese aircraft began their own startup procedures. Radio checks confirmed all aircraft were operational and ready. Raptor led to all aircraft prepare for takeoff sequence. Morrison transmitted. American formation, first followed by JASDF formation. Rendezvous at waypoint Alpha Angels 15. Acknowledgements came from all pilots. Morrison advanced the throttle, feeling the powerful surge as the F-35 accelerated down the runway and lifted into the clear blue sky. One by one, the other aircraft followed, forming up in a perfect arrowhead pattern as they climbed to 15,000 feet. The Japanese F-35s joined them moments later, establishing a parallel formation. From the cockpit, Morrison had a perfect view of the sleek fighters, their distinctive profiles cutting through the air with deadly grace. He identified Aircraft 3 in the Japanese formation, watching it carefully as they began the demonstration sequence. The first phase consisted of basic formation maneuvers, turns, altitude changes, and speed variations. Everything proceeded flawlessly, the 10 aircraft moving as if linked by invisible bonds. Morrison kept his attention divided between flying his own aircraft and monitoring the Japanese fighter Callahan had flagged. Transition to Phase 2. Morrison transmitted. Combat maneuvering demonstrations, sequential breaks on my mark. This phase would involve higher G maneuvers, with each aircraft performing individual combat turns before rejoining formation. As they began the sequence, Morrison noticed something, a subtle change in the engine note from the Japanese Aircraft 3. Not a malfunction, but a distinct tonal shift that occurred during a high G turn. He might never have noticed it without Callahan's warning, but now that he was listening for it, the discrepancy was unmistakable. It wasn't constant, appearing only during specific combinations of power setting and G-force, but it was definitely there. Morrison completed the demonstration sequence without comment, bringing the formation back to standard flight pattern. As they prepared for the final phase, a low-level flyby over the base, he made a decision. Raptor led to Sakura 3, he transmitted using the Japanese flight's call sign. I'm picking up an unusual harmonic in your engine note during high G maneuvers. Recommend you reduce to 70% power for the remainder of the demonstration. There was a brief pause before the Japanese pilot responded. Sakura 3 acknowledges, may I ask the nature of the anomaly? Morrison chose his words carefully. Similar to an issue we recently diagnosed in one of our aircraft. Possible pressure variation in the bleed air system. Nothing critical at present, but worth examining before your return flight. Understood. Raptor lead, reducing power as advised. The remainder of the demonstration proceeded without incident. The flyby over the base was perfect. 10 F-35s in tight formation, roaring over the viewing area where Thompson, Takahashi, and the other officials stood. Morrison led the formation back to pattern altitude, then coordinated a sequential landing. As he taxied to the designated area, Morrison saw a group waiting, Thompson, Takahashi, and Callahan among them. Their expressions were serious, and Morrison knew immediately that his in-flight observation had already been relayed to the ground. He completed shutdown procedures and climbed down from the cockpit. Before he could remove his helmet, General Takahashi approached with a deep bow. Colonel Morrison, I must express my profound gratitude, the Japanese officer said formally. Your observation may have prevented a serious incident. Our ground team has confirmed an anomalous pressure reading in Sakura 3's bleed air system, not sufficient to trigger warnings, but definitely abnormal. Morrison removed his helmet. I'm glad it was caught, sir. To be honest, Colonel Callahan deserves the credit. He suggested I listen for that specific anomaly. Takahashi turned to Callahan with evident respect. Most impressive, Colonel. First you diagnose an American aircraft, then predict a similar issue in one of ours. Your reputation is well-deserved. Thompson joined them, satisfaction evident on his face. This is exactly why we're re-establishing the program, General Takahashi. Some problems can't be detected by computers alone. I could not agree more, Takahashi replied, which is why I would like to formally request that Japan be included in your new training initiative. My superiors in Tokyo have already expressed strong support for such collaboration. The conversation continued as they walked toward the briefing area, the successful demonstration, and the discovered anomaly cementing the value of Callahan's approach in everyone's minds. Morrison found himself walking slightly behind the senior officers, processing what had just happened. He had detected a problem that no instrument had flagged, guided only by Callahan's suggestion to listen for a specific sound pattern. It wasn't mystical or supernatural as Callahan had emphasized. It was simply trained awareness, the human senses doing what they were evolved to do, detect patterns and anomalies that might indicate danger. The remainder of the day was consumed with debriefings and technical discussions. The Japanese maintenance team worked alongside American technicians to diagnose the issue with Sakura 3, confirming Callahan's suspicion of a developing pressure fracture in the bleed air system. It wasn't identical to the American F-35's problem, but it was similar enough to suggest a potential design vulnerability that affected both nations' aircraft. By evening, the formal activities had concluded, but the work was just beginning. Morrison found himself in a conference room with Thompson Hayes Callahan and several staff officers planning the structure of the new training program. "We need to move quickly," Thompson said, reviewing the proposed curriculum. "Headquarters is enthusiastic, especially after today's demonstration, but bureaucratic momentum has a way of dissipating if we don't capitalize immediately. The basic framework is solid," Hayes observed, examining Callahan's draft syllabus. 8 weeks of intensive training, combining classroom theory with practical application. The question is scale. How many students initially? "Start small," Callahan advised. 12 to 15 maximum for the first cohort. Quality matters more than quantity at this stage. Morrison nodded in agreement. "We should select candidates carefully. Technical aptitude is essential, but we also need people with the right mindset. Curious, observant, open to unconventional approaches." "Like Sergeant Rodriguez," Callahan suggested. "Exactly," Morrison agreed. "In fact, I'd like to nominate him as our first official student." Thompson made a note. "Done. We'll need instructors beyond Colonel Callahan. I've received positive responses from Mendoza and Washington. They'll arrive next week." Diaz is still confirming her availability. The planning continued late into the evening, details taking shape with each passing hour. A name was chosen for the program: ECHO, Enhanced Comprehensive Human Observation. The acronym was Thompson's idea, a nod to the acoustic aspect of the methodology while avoiding direct reference to the classified Unit 777. As the meeting concluded, Thompson pulled Morrison aside. "You did well today, Colonel, both in the air and in recognizing the value of what Callahan has to offer." "Thank you, sir. It's been educational." "It's more than that," Thompson said, his voice serious. "What we're doing here could fundamentally change maintenance practices throughout the Air Force. The implications extend far beyond fixing a few problematic F-35s. Morrison nodded, understanding the broader significance. "If I may ask, sir, why wasn't this done years ago? Why let Unit 777's expertise fade away in the first place?" Thompson sighed, looking suddenly older. "Institutional momentum, budget constraints, the seductive promise of technology solving all our problems." He shook his head. "But mostly it was forgetting a fundamental truth: machines are built by humans for humans. The connection between the two can never be fully replaced by algorithms and sensors." The general clapped Morrison on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Colonel. Tomorrow begins a new chapter for all of us." As the room emptied, Morrison found Callahan still seated at the table reviewing notes from the meeting. The older man looked tired but satisfied. "Long day," Morrison commented, taking a seat beside him. "One of many to come," Callahan replied. He closed the folder before him. "You did good work up there today, Colonel, spotting that anomaly in the Japanese aircraft." "I only knew what to listen for because you told me," Morrison admitted. "Without that guidance, I'd never have noticed." "That's the point of training," Callahan said. "Eventually, you won't need specific guidance. Your senses will pick up anomalies automatically, the way an experienced musician hears a single wrong note in a symphony." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. "May I ask you something personal, sir?" Morrison finally said. Callahan nodded, his expression curious. "Why did you agree to this after being retired for so long, after the Air Force essentially discarded your expertise? Why come back?" Callahan considered the question carefully. "Partly for the men and women I served with in Unit 777. Their knowledge deserves to be preserved." He paused, his eyes distant. "But mostly for the next generation. The pilots who will fly these aircraft, whose lives depend on them functioning correctly. The maintainers who keep them flying, often with inadequate tools or information." He looked directly at Morrison. "I didn't come back for recognition or to prove I was right all along. I came back because some knowledge is too valuable to lose, even if its value isn't always recognized." The simple honesty of the statement struck Morrison deeply. In a military culture often dominated by career advancement and technological supremacy, Callahan's motivation stood out for its purity, the desire to preserve knowledge that saved lives. "Thank you," Morrison said quietly, "for coming when Colonel Hayes called, for sharing what you know, for all of it." Callahan smiled slightly. "You're welcome." He stood gathering his materials. "We should both get some rest. Tomorrow will be busy." 3 months later, Morrison stood at the edge of a hangar, watching the first class of Echo trainees gather around an aircraft engine. At the center of the group, Callahan demonstrated a diagnostic technique, his weathered hands moving with precision across the metal surface. The program had grown rapidly from concept to reality. The success of the international demonstration, combined with the discovery of similar issues in several other F-35s, had convinced Air Force leadership of the program's value. Funding had been allocated, facilities designated, and personnel assigned with remarkable speed. Frank Mendoza and James Washington had arrived as promised, bringing their specialized expertise to complement Callahan's. Maria Diaz had joined them 2 weeks later after concluding her academic commitments. Together with Callahan, they formed the core of the instructional team, the living repository of Unit 777's knowledge. Sergeant Rodriguez had been joined by 14 other students carefully selected from maintenance units across the Air Force. They ranged from young specialists to seasoned master sergeants, all united by a common quality: the intuitive understanding that machines communicated in ways beyond digital readouts and error codes. The Japanese connection had blossomed as well. 2 JASDF maintenance officers had joined the program as observers with plans for a full exchange program in the coming year. General Takahashi had become one of the initiative's strongest advocates, speaking directly to the Joint Chiefs about its value for Allied interoperability. "Impressive progress," Hayes said, joining Morrison at the hangar entrance. "3 months ago, this was just an idea. Now look at it." Morrison nodded. "It's been remarkable, though I give most of the credit to Callahan and the other Unit 777 veterans. Their knowledge has been the foundation of everything." "True, but don't underestimate your own contribution," Hayes replied. "Your support gave the program credibility with the operational community. Pilots trust other pilots." They watched as Callahan completed his demonstration, then divided the students into small groups for hands-on practice. The methodology was taking shape, a systematic approach to heightened sensory awareness that could be taught, practiced, and mastered. "Have you heard the latest?" Hayes asked. "Lockheed Martin is sending a technical team next month. They want to incorporate some of these techniques into their official maintenance protocols." Morrison raised his eyebrows. "That's a significant development, from skepticism to corporate adoption in 3 months. Results speak for themselves," Hayes observed. 12 potential failures identified and prevented before they occurred. Maintenance efficiency up 30% at bases where Echo graduates have been assigned. He smiled. Not bad for a program based on listening to aircraft. Across the hangar, Callahan looked up, catching Morrison's eye. The older man nodded slightly, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement between colleagues who had come to respect each other deeply. In that moment, Morrison reflected on how much had changed since their first meeting at Callahan's workshop. He had transformed from a skeptic to a believer, not in anything mystical or supernatural, but in the profound connection between human awareness and mechanical systems. The F-35s on the flight line were still marvels of modern technology, still packed with sensors and computers beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. But they remained at their core machines built by human hands to serve human purposes. And the human element, the experience, intuition, and sensory awareness that Callahan embodied, remained irreplaceable. As Morrison watched the Echo trainees absorb Callahan's wisdom, he understood that they were witnessing the preservation of something precious. Not just technical knowledge, but a philosophy that recognized the limits of automation and the enduring value of human perception. The soul of the fighter jet wasn't in its stealth materials or its advanced avionics. It was in the profound connection between the machine and those who flew and maintained it. And thanks to Robert Callahan and Unit 777, that connection would endure for generations to come. In the desert air of Arizona, under the vast blue sky, where aircraft had flown for over a century, a tradition was being renewed. The tradition of humans and machines working together, communicating in languages, both digital and sensory, each complementing the other's strengths. It was a harmony as old as aviation itself, temporarily forgotten in the rush of technological advancement, now rediscovered and reinforced. And in that harmony lay the future of air power, not in technology alone, but in the perfect integration of human and machine. As if sensing Morrison's thoughts, Callahan looked up again from his instruction. This time the older man smiled fully, his weathered face transformed by an expression of genuine satisfaction. It was the smile of a man who had seen his life's work, validated his knowledge, preserved his legacy, secured. Morrison returned the smile, offering a slight salute of respect. Together, they had done something significant. Not just fixing a single aircraft, but changing the way an entire organization thought about the relationship between humans and technology. And in a world increasingly dominated by automation and artificial intelligence, that might prove to be the most important maintenance task of all.